Thank you for joining us, Pro Tem.
Thank you. Appreciate being here.
So this year seems a little different than a lot of years. How are things going?
Well, I think things are going well. I think sometimes we forget the good things that have happened. A lot of good legislation went through these two bodies early in the session, particularly our funding, getting our budget balanced, providing more funds for education, early reading, different things like that. Those were kind of early in the session, and then we have focused so much on the Medicaid expansion issue, on the funding formula for public schools and so forth, that a lot of the focus has shifted over to there, and those are some of the things we're still struggling with, and so people think, well, that's all we've done all session, but really there have been a lot of good things happen, I think.
Yeah, what's the story of the 2019 legislative session? When you go back to Rexburg and tell your grandkids, this is what I did. What are you going to tell them?
Well, especially since you put it talking to my grandkids, obviously they and their parents are interested in education, and that's still the top priority for the legislature. I mean, just look at the funding. I mean, that's where most of the funding goes. And so for the 5th year in a row, we have increased education funding by over $100 million each of those years. So we're now spending $500 million more on public education than we were 5 years ago. And so I think that is a positive thing. As you know, Governor Little had some priorities when it came to public education. One of them was to get beginning teacher salaries up over at least at $40,000 a year, and that's been put into place to phase in over the next 2 years. He was very concerned about the reading initiative to make sure our children were reading well by the time they got to 3rd grade. It's just a real indicator of how they're going to do not only in their educational career, but in other life goals as well, to be able to read by the 3rd grade. So we doubled the investment in that, I think another $13 million. And so things like that I think are positive. They're going to pay long-term dividends. Are we going to see the result immediately? Not necessarily, but over the long term, we're going to see that these were good investments. And I credit the governor for showing some leadership in those things.
Yeah, I've been surprised talking to people in corrections or even probation or in law enforcement. A lot of them have said, we would gladly give up some of our money to get it to those kids early on, because that 3rd grade indicator isn't just an indicator for education, it's also an indicator of whether they're going to go into a life of crime, whether they're going to be successful,
Exactly.
all of these other things. But also that was kind of a continuation of our 5-year plan.
Right.
That came out of the governor's task force. We're done with that now. What's the vision at this point? We're going into uncharted territory next year.
Well, what I like about it, and I talked to candidate Little during the summer about this, and he's been very receptive and to the idea of continuing that a working group to keep that 5-year plan perpetuating, so that we don't just come to the end of this next 5 year or this 5-year thing, which will end next year, and then wonder where we're going from there. We've had some amazing success the last 5 years, not only in the funding for education, but in the whole process and in the buy-in that the legislature has into that process. We've argued less about public education funding in the last 5 years than ever before in the time I've been here. And so I'm glad to see he wants to continue with that. He wants to put a working group together with the stakeholders, similar to what we had 5 years ago, and hopefully have that an ongoing thing that we're always looking 4 or 5 years down the road to see what we can do to make our education system even better for our children.
And I've been kind of looking at the funding formula, interim committee, the 5-year plan, the task force group, kind of next to each other, and thinking, like, what was so successful about that task force that kind of did bring in, countless policies. They got the stuff done. Everyone was on board. They got buy-in. The funding formula seems maybe not so much. They're having a little bit more trouble getting the buy-in. Is there a difference in leadership there, or is it a difference in tactics? Like, what's different there?
It's the issues that they're dealing with. The 5-year plan is much more broad, and then as we get into each of those 5 years, we are fleshing out the details of it. And there's often disagreement on how those details should come about. With the funding formula, actually there was a great deal of agreement among the stakeholders with the concepts. It's when you start looking at the numbers and how it affects an individual school district or an individual classroom and trying to come up with an equitable way to distribute those funds, that's where the problems come in. And so I think that the concepts, the ideas, the principles that are there that this committee's been working on for the last 2.5 years, and when I say this committee, I'm not talking just about legislators, I'm talking about educators and administrators and other stakeholders in this. I think the principles are still sound, and I think they're still intact, and that there's good agreement on it. When you start working out each individual detail, that's where it kind of falls apart a little bit, and it's just going to take a little longer than what we thought it was going to when we had so much agreement to start with. It's going to take a little bit longer, and so I see that coming together next session, but we are running out of time this session to actually solidify that.
Yes, Senator Mortimer told me now is the time. We got to get this done. It seemed like there was, if not a deadline, it seemed like people are trying to manufacture one. Is it disappointing that we walked out of this legislature without a new funding formula?
I think there's some disappointment there, particularly those who have worked so hard on it. Like I say, they've been working 2.5 years on this, and they've had consultants come in, and they've listened to testimony, and they've tried to establish some ideas. They put together a template for the formula, where you crank this up a little bit, what does it do over here, and things like that, and they put a lot of work into it. Anytime you put your heart and soul into something, you want to see results. And so, those who have worked on it particularly, I think they would have liked to have seen it come more to fruition this year.
And we've spent a lot of money on it,
and we spent a lot of money on it, too. But at the same time, I don't want anybody to think that money or that time is wasted. We will continue to build on that. It's just taken longer to get that final buy-in and put those final details together than what we had anticipated, or what we had hoped, I guess I should say. And so it'll come together, and it'll be built on that foundation that committee and the research and the time being spent, that foundation has been built, and we'll go from there.
It seemed like in the beginning of the session, maybe some of those large, grandiose, ambitious plans were kind of stamped down a little bit because we didn't know how the money was going to come in.
Right.
I talked to the tax commission yesterday. They said the revenues are coming in just about how we projected. They're going to be slow, but we should have all the money that we thought we were going to have. When we get to the summer and we might have like a $300 million surplus, is it going to be disappointing that money's not in teachers' pockets or on the roads or heck in taxpayers' pockets when we're all sitting around there and looking at this money sitting in a vault?
Well, certainly we had to be conservative because there was so much uncertainty out there. The last thing we wanted to do was appropriate funds and then have to hold them back because the money didn't come in. And we went some early months here with some pretty dismal results because of the way the withholding was with the new tax law, not knowing exactly what those effects would be. It does look like now, with last month and probably this month, that we're making that up, and we hope to be very close to what was projected in the first place, which was an 8.2% growth that the governor's office thought we would have. We'll probably come in pretty close to that, at least we hope we do. But to spend that without knowing for sure, or even having a better idea that was going to happen, that would have been irresponsible on our part, and put some, education, transportation, whatever, in some very uncomfortable situations of expecting the money and then not getting it. We can always dip into those funds next year and help make that up and fill the holes that we had to leave. But yes, we were very careful. We were frugal this year because we were uncertain of what the revenues would look like.
What are those holes that you want to fill next year?
Well, I think, again, looking forward to education. I think the governor has talked about some sales tax relief, possibly on sales tax on groceries. There's support on that. There's some disadvantages as well. But we just didn't dare go out on the limb with extra tax relief, extra money going to transportation that was committed at the front end, like taking money off the top off a sales tax or something. We were reluctant to do that, not knowing how that might affect the bottom line and what the future economy will hold as well. One point I would make is we've done a real good job of building up our reserves. And of course, whatever we don't spend this year, if it comes out better, that becomes part of those reserves to some extent. And we can dip into those reserves as we need to, not only to fill up those holes, but also to help us if we get into an economic turndown like we have many times, and like we know we will, we just don't know what the timing is. We've got some good reserves built up, and we'll all be grateful for that when that comes.
Well, and you've been to the Associated Taxpayers of Idaho the last
Yes.
couple of years where they're like, it's coming, it's coming, it's coming.
We're grateful to hold it off as long as we can, but we'll be better prepared, and the longer we can hold it off, the better prepared we will be. Idaho's doing great, and that's not true universally with every state across the union. As I talk to my colleagues in other states, some states are struggling economically, and we're not talking just energy-dependent states. Some states are having a tough time. As we all know, Idaho's growing rapidly. We have low unemployment. Our income levels are growing, and they needed to. But there are a lot of good things happening in Idaho that make it very attractive, not only for people looking to come to Idaho, but for those of us who are already here. Makes it an attractive place to live, to do business, and to raise our families, and to keep our families here.
If we're all going to go out and appreciate the wonderful state of Idaho, we need to get out of this building.
We do. And you want to know when.
I'm not as much concerned about when as how. I mean, it seems like the big issue holding us up is the sideboards on Medicaid expansion.
Right.
We had a hearing in Health and Welfare a couple days ago that could only be written by a Hollywood scriptwriter. I mean, getting a decision dropped by a judge right in the middle of a committee hearing an issue very similar was amazing, and then that bill was held in committee. Is that bill dead?
Well, possibly. We have two bills out there that are still possibilities, and that's one of them. The other one is 1204, which is a Senate bill that has already come out of that committee. It's in the amending order right now, and once something's in the amending order, you can do with it whatever you want, as long as you have the majority of the people on your side to do it. And so I think that will become a vehicle as we look at what is it we need to do in order to get the votes in both houses to fund Medicaid expansion. The governor's made it clear, we're not going home until Medicaid expansion is funded. The Senate has already passed Medicaid expansion funding. The funding bill went out of the Senate on a 31-3 vote. And so there is a definite commitment to fund Medicaid as required by the initiative that was passed by the people of Idaho. Most legislators are not fighting that. But again, there are many legislators that feel like there need to be some, you can call them sideboards. Some of them are actually enhancements that most people would buy into, quite frankly. So we have a list of 5. 3 of those, almost everyone would be in agreement with. Obviously, the biggest hang-up right now is work. Should it be mandatory? Should it be voluntary? Should it be anything? And so those are the things that are holding us up probably in trying to determine how many votes do we have for voluntary, how many do we have for mandatory, how does the minority party come into that and so forth. Everyone is a player in this one. Everyone and every party is a player in it. And so coming up with just the right combinations so that can get through, probably with the minimum amount of restrictions, but at the same time enough to get the funding formulas, the funding bills out of both houses. That's important, and that's what we're striving to do.
In light of what the judge said, the district judge, are mandatory work requirements still even on the table? He was pretty clear saying mandatory work does not have anything to do with providing insurance and should not be involved.
Well, I'm not sure that's what as you read the decision itself, there were some reasons that he outlined, and certainly when a judge makes a ruling, we need to look at what were his concerns. Did he say that mandatory work absolutely, is out of the question? No, he didn't say that, but he said it depends on how it's structured. If it's being used to exclude people, not provide them access to the services and so forth, then that's what we've got to avoid. Again, I think that at least the mandatory work requirements that I've seen are about as lenient as any that I've seen that still have mandatory work requirements. much more lenient than what we have for the SNAP program or for the unemployment compensation program. And so they're very lenient, but we want to make sure that they would meet whatever requirements or at least address the concerns that the judge has. Even though that's not our district there, the judges depend on one another and the rulings in various districts. And we want to do it right. We want to do it the right way. And so, certainly there are those who say, oh, it doesn't matter what the judge said, we're just going to do it. I think the more reasoned legislators are looking, okay, if we do want some type of mandatory work requirements, what's the best way to function them so that we're not trying to deny access or restrict access to the program, and so that we're meeting the requirements the judge set forth.
And it seems like the Senate has a window that it's comfortable with. It seems like the House has a window that it's comfortable with. And I heard that leadership sat down with the governor. He kind of explained his window that he's comfortable with.
We met with the governor this morning, yes.
So do any of these bills fit into all three of these windows?
Well, that's what we're trying to decide, because it's not just a matter of the governor, the House, and the Senate. In the House and the Senate in particular, you've got people on both sides, in both bodies. And so it's trying to find just the right combination, because it's not a matter of a body being for this and another body being for that. It's a matter that you got to have 18 votes in one body, 36 votes in the other body, in order to get something through. And so it's trying to find the right people with the right votes to come up with the best combination that's going to serve the people of Idaho and keep in the spirit as much as we can, in a compassionate way, with what the people voted on when they voted for Prop 2. I think that's important. I think we should never forget that, or think that the people now don't have a say in that. We need to take into account what they were saying, but we need to do it in a fiscally responsible way as well. And so we need to be careful not to condemn those legislators who feel like we need to look at the fiscal side of it and put some protections in there, that we don't have some unintended consequences that could really hurt the state as a whole going down the road. Now, there are people that scoff at that and say, hey, we shouldn't consider that. But I think most legislators are just trying to act responsibly. And their responsibility is to the citizens, not only to implement Medicaid, which they're trying to do, but also to do it in a compassionate and a responsible way.
How does this ballot initiative bill fit into this? Are these two independent things, or are they being talked about together?
Well, they're being talked about together because a lot of people are putting them together. I've said all along, this was bad timing for that ballot initiative. This is something that has been talked about for years. I have long been concerned with the underrepresentation of rural areas in Idaho, that they get to vote on the whole thing, but they don't have any say in the process of what are the important issues facing Idahoans.
Well, why does it matter that a rural person is involved in the process? I mean, isn't every Idaho citizen just as important as every other one?
Absolutely, absolutely. But when we vote on something in the Senate, we don't just say, now the urban senators can vote on this, but the rest of you can't. We have to look at how it affects everyone. There are some issues that are of more concern to urban areas, and others that are more concerned to the rural areas. But it should be looking across the state as much as possible as a whole to see what areas are important enough that we actually want to put it down as a ballot initiative, and not just having 4 urban areas in the whole state, which is what we have now. You could get all of the signatures from 4 urban areas in the state, leave everyone out of that decision-making process. So I think there's some validity to it. Now, was it put together just exactly the way I would have put together? No, but I think the motives, there's some good motives there. We may see some changes, if not this session, next session, to try to maybe back off a little bit on it, but at the same time, we need to keep true to those principles. And I think the motives were good. The way it came out, timing was bad. We may have to look at it down the road to make sure it's accomplishing what those motives were trying to dictate.
Well, and I think that gets lost in this debate. I mean, this is an argument that dates back to the Federalist Papers. I mean,
Absolutely.
Madison and Hamilton were talking about this back then, and comes all the way up through here. It's not just in Idaho. There's at least 12 other states that are looking at similar things, and I think last year there were 138 pieces of legislation that dealt with ballot initiatives.
Right.
So, I mean, this isn't just an Idaho thing. This isn't
half
just an Idaho
half
thing.
the states don't even have a ballot initiative process. and nobody's looking at them and saying, they're squashing the democratic republic that we have here and so forth. But our Constitution does provide for that, and as such, we need to provide for it, and we need to do it in a way that is reasonable and makes it possible for the people to do that. And I think that's the goal of what we're looking at. To the extent that it may not be achieving that, we need to look at it further.
Should we have ballot initiatives?
I think so, but even those who support ballot initiatives don't think they should be easy to get on the ballot. Even the greatest proponents or opponents of 1159 agreed that there should be some restrictions there. It should not be an easy process. We do not want to turn into California, where you have 18 or 20 ballot initiatives, and the ones that pass are the ones that have the most money behind them to do the advertising that nobody can dispute. But at the same time, I think it's an important process that our Idaho Constitution protects. We don't have ballot initiatives at the federal level, but we do at the Idaho level. It's something our Constitution guarantees, and I've sworn to support our Idaho Constitution until that changes. If we don't think we should have ballot initiatives, then we need to go after constitutional amendment. But I think they're a good thing.
I was doing some math yesterday. I was looking at
doing math.
I was doing a little bit of math.
I'm a CPA. So
I know you could probably
maybe we
correct
can
my
talk the
numbers,
same
yeah.
language here.
So I was thinking of as far as like getting the best things on the ballot. It apparently would take about 91,761 signatures from these counties in legislative districts to get a ballot initiative on.
Mm-hmm.
To get all 105 legislators on the ballot, it would only take 5,250, or less than that because you can just pay the $50.
Right.
Should we like? How should I read those two things in connection to each other?
Well, I'm not
the
sure.
ballot initiatives are very hard. Legislators not very hard.
Well, that is true. But again, anyone can run for the legislature with either signatures or paying $50 to do it. So running for public office, I don't think is the same as a ballot initiative because it is intentionally made very easy. There's no problem with having 15 choices of a legislative office as compared to having 15 ballot initiatives to vote on in a general election, because we have a process to narrow that down through a primary campaign, but not only that, through a primary election and so forth, to get down so that when you end up going into the voting booth in November for that general election, you got two choices on that particular race to choose from. And so your numbers are not lost on me, okay? We should not make it so difficult that it can't be done. I'm in total agreement with that. But I'm not sure that that's the best comparison either.
I mean, obviously the legislators are far more interesting, complex people than a simple ballot initiative.
Sometimes we're not.
I wanted to get you out on one of the projects you've been working on for a long time, adding the words to the
Human Rights Act, yes.
What's been going on behind the scenes? Are we going to see this happen anytime soon?
Well, not a lot's been going on behind the scenes in the last month or so. As you know, we worked on that. We had our own little working group. It was not a formal working group. It was just some people that got together, not just legislators and not just people from one house or from one party. We talked about some possibilities, but let's face the facts. Just adding the words without even considering what concerns there are out there for how that might affect religious freedoms. And whenever you talk about sexuality, religious issues come into play, whether you like it or not, or whether you think they should or not. In people's hearts and in people's minds, there's some connection there. And so it's going to have to be some kind of balanced approach where we at least look at the fears and the concerns of both sides. And I don't mean to say there's sides. I mean both points of view. There are religious people who are gay and vice versa. And so it's not a matter of picking sides. It's a matter of being sensitive to the concerns of others. And if we'll listen to that, then I think that there are some solutions we can come to where if everyone can get 95% of what it is they want, by giving something to the other side, that seems like a pretty good deal in most of the political compromises that I try to work with. But if we are not willing, and I'm not picking on any one side, if we are not willing to give the other side anything more than what they already have, it's going to be hard to come to anything that the legislature can act on. Sometimes we compare it to Utah, but quite frankly, the legislature did not shove anything down the throats of the people in Utah. You had the religious community and you had the LGBTQ community coming together. They basically worked something out that addressed the concerns and the issues on both sides. And even though the legislature was involved to some degree, they came to the legislature and said, hey, we have a compromise here, and it was pretty easy to enact it. It is more difficult if the legislature is going to take the lead and if we're only going to listen to one side or the other. It's going to have to be some kind of compromise legislation, and for those who are not willing to compromise, it just isn't going to happen.
And I've always been confused throughout the years of what the compromise is over. It seems like you have one side that's worried about their religious freedoms being under attack. The other side wants the words added.
Right.
Like, what's the compromise in the middle? Like, what's being negotiated? Like,
well, that's not that difficult, actually. I mean, if you can add the words, so to speak, whether it's in that section or some other section of statute, if you can protect people from discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity, for purposes of their housing, so that they don't lose their housing, for purposes of their job, that they don't have to worry about their employment, and for purposes of public accommodations as well. You know, that they're not going to get kicked off a bus or something, a public bus or something like that. If you can provide those protections, but maybe, you know, look at some exemptions that really affect a very small percentage of circumstances. A protection for a religious institution as such. Right now, our religious freedoms allow a religious institution to hire people only of their own faith if they want. Well, that's pretty restrictive. You and I are of different faiths. I mean, maybe, you know, I may want to hire you, if I'm a religious institution, somebody to get some diversity you know, for instance, religious universities do it quite often, hire professors. They want to admit students from various, you know, religious denominations. But at the same time, if they have a standard, a code of ethics, a code of behavior that they want to employ within this private organization called a religious institution, they ought to be able to do that, and they can't fully do that under present law. They're really minor, in my mind. They're really minor concessions to make, and they affect a very small percentage of circumstances. But for those who are worried about those kinds of things, they're important. And so we've got to listen to each other. We've got to communicate with one another and try to put ourselves in the other situation to try to see what can we do as long as I'm getting most of what I want.
Can one of these things be done without the other? Or do they need to be done together?
In my mind, at least not in my tenure, probably not in my lifetime, not in Idaho. We're going to have to work together to try to come to something where we can address the issues on both sides of that. If we're not willing to do that, it's going to be a long, long time before we take the steps that are needed, because none of us believe in discrimination. None of us believe that that's a good thing under any circumstances. And so should there be protections there? Yeah, there should. But it's very, very difficult to get those kind of protections through the Idaho legislature without considering some concerns on the other side when it comes to religious protections as well.
Well, as we all pack up to head home, it sounds like we're still going to have some stuff to come back to next year.
Oh yeah, we didn't want to get everything resolved this year. We will be back next year, and hopefully we'll be dealing with probably the same issues, but hopefully at a higher level.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.